Jagged pink tissue crawled up her jawline, tight and shining under the neon bar sign. She traced the condensation on her beer, ignoring the drunk Marines behind her. They laughed, pointing at her neck, calling her a freak. They had no idea what it cost to survive. The dive bar smelled of old bleach, stale fryer grease, and the sour tang of spilled draft beer that had seeped into the floorboards decades ago. Rowan sat at the far end of the mahogany counter, the wood worn smooth by thousands of elbows before hers. The neon Pabst Blue Ribbon sign in the window hummed with a defective, erratic buzz, casting a sickly blue and red hue across her right cheek. She wasn't looking for trouble. She wasn't looking for anything, really, except the temporary numbness that came with cheap domestic lager and the ambient noise of a room where nobody knew her. Her right hand rested around her glass. The ring finger twitched, a slight, involuntary tremor. Nerve damage. A parting gift from a concrete courtyard in Rakkar. She pressed her thumb hard against the glass, letting the freezing condensation bite into her skin until the tremor stopped. "Make it another," she told the bartender, a weary man in his 60s who communicated mostly in grunts and heavy paws. He didn't look at her face for longer than a second. People rarely did. They looked, their eyes widened slightly, and then they looked away, suddenly fascinated by the tap handles or the dirty rags in their hands. Rowan preferred it that way. The scars were not the cool, cinematic kind. They didn't tell a story of heroic sword fights or clean bullets. They were a violent, chaotic mess. The blast had melted the synthetic collar of her combat shirt into her neck. The resulting graft was a rigid, zipper-like ridge of thick, shiny pink tissue that dug into her collarbone and crept up the side of her jaw, pulling the corner of her mouth into a perpetual slight grimace. It ached when it rained. It pulled painfully tight when she turned her head too fast. Worse than the pain was the texture. It felt dead, like touching melted wax instead of human skin. Behind her, the front door of the bar rattled open, letting in a gust of damp, coastal air and the loud, overlapping voices of 4 young men. Rowan didn't have to turn around to know who they were. The heavy, syncopated thud of standard-issue boots on the sticky linoleum. The overpowering, aggressive cloud of body spray mixed with the metallic scent of adrenaline and youth. The volume of their voices, pitched to a level that demanded everyone in the room acknowledge their presence. Marines. Fresh off a deployment, or maybe just fresh out of training, riding the high of their own perceived invincibility. She took a slow breath, letting the sour air fill her lungs, and hunched her shoulders slightly, making herself smaller. They took the booth directly behind her stool. The leather groaned under their weight. "I'm telling you, man, the sergeant major had no idea. Completely clueless!" One of them barked, slamming a fist onto the table in punctuation. Laughter erupted, loud and braying. Rowan kept her eyes on the muted television above the bar, where a local news anchor was mouthing words she couldn't hear. She took a slow sip of her beer. It was lukewarm now, but she swallowed it anyway, feeling the carbonation scrape down her throat. Hey, look at that." The voice was lower this time, but the sudden drop in volume made it cut through the ambient noise of the bar even sharper. It was the voice of someone pointing. Rowan felt the familiar, crawling sensation at the base of her skull. The instinctual awareness of being watched. "Jesus, you think it's contagious?" Another voice snickered. Looks like she tried to make out with a blowtorch. A hot, ugly flush crept up Rowan's neck, blooming under the scar tissue and making it burn. She didn't feel a sudden surge of righteous, badass fury. She didn't feel like a Tier 1 operator ready to dispense justice. She just felt exhausted. And underneath the exhaustion, a pathetic, deeply human wave of shame that she hated herself for feeling. Before the blast, she had been unremarkable in a way she now desperately missed. Brown hair, straight nose, a face that blended into a crowd. Now she was a spectacle, a walking Halloween mask. "Keep your voice down, Miller," a third voice muttered, sounding half-hearted. "Why? It's a public bar," the one named Miller replied, his voice rising, emboldened by the alcohol. "I'm just saying, you gotta put a warning label on something like that. Kinda ruins the appetite, you know?" Rowan set her glass down. The clink of the heavy glass against the wood was soft, but it echoed in her own ears. Her jaw clenched, the scar pulling tight, restricting the movement of her neck. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. "Just let it go," she told herself. "They're kids. Dumb, arrogant, unbroken kids." She remembered being 21, invincible, wrapped in Kevlar and arrogance, believing the world bent to the will of a rifle barrel. They hadn't seen the things that turn bone to powder. They hadn't smelled burning hair and copper in a pitch-black room. She raised a hand to signal the bartender for her check. She just wanted to go back to her motel, take her muscle relaxers, and sleep. But Miller wasn't done. The scraping of a chair leg against the floorboards signaled his movement. A heavy, unbalanced footstep stopped right behind her stool. Rowan smelled him before he spoke. Peppermint gum, stale beer, and the distinctive metallic sweat of someone who drank too much the night before and was trying to drink through the hangover. "Hey," Miller said, his voice dropping into a register he probably thought was intimidating. "We're trying to enjoy a few rounds back here. You're kinda killing the view." Rowan didn't turn around. She kept her eyes fixed on the condensation pooling at the base of her empty glass. Her silence hung in the air, heavy and thick. "I'm talking to you, Freddy Krueger." Miller sneered, stepping closer. The physical proximity triggered a violent, deeply ingrained reflex in Rowan's central nervous system. Her body, trained for years to react to spatial intrusions with immediate, overwhelming force, screamed at her to pivot. Her brain automatically calculated the distance, 14 inches. Pivot on the left foot, drive the right elbow back into the floating ribs, follow through with a crushed trachea. The sequence flashed behind her eyes in a fraction of a second, as vivid as a movie screen. Her right hand squeezed the edge of the bar counter until her knuckles turned white. She forced herself to breathe out, a long, slow exhalation through her nose. She finally turned her head, just enough to catch him in her peripheral vision. Miller was tall, maybe 6'2", broad-shouldered, with a high and tight haircut that looked fresh from the clippers. His face was flushed, his eyes glassy and slightly unfocused. He was smiling, a cruel, lopsided smirk that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Bar's pretty big," Rowan said. Her voice was flat, carrying the gravelly rasp of vocal cords that had inhaled too much smoke and sand. "Move your seats." Miller let out a short, incredulous laugh and looked back at his table. "You hear this? She's telling us to move." He looked back at Rowan, leaning in closer. "We don't move. We just got back from Okinawa. We go where we want." Okinawa. Rowan almost let out a tired sigh. Okinawa was a peacetime posting. A vacation with mandatory PT. These boys were playing soldier, wearing the uniform like a costume, mistaking a clean deployment for the reality of the grind. "Congratulations," Rowan said, her tone dead. "I'll let the bartender know to give you a lollipop. Now back off." She grabbed a crumpled $20 bill from her pocket and tossed it onto the damp wood. She slid off the stool, her boots hitting the floor with a quiet, grounded thud. She was significantly shorter than Miller, barely scraping 5'7", but her posture was rigid. As she turned to walk towards the door, Miller stepped into her path. "Whoa, hold on. I didn't say you were excused." He slurred, reaching out and planting a heavy, clumsy hand squarely on her left shoulder. It was the wrong shoulder. Underneath her canvas jacket, the skin of her left shoulder was a road map of shrapnel scars and surgically repaired muscle tissue. The sudden, unyielding pressure of his hand sent a sharp, electric spike of pain shooting straight up her neck and down her spine. Rowan didn't gasp. She didn't flinch away. Instead, she went terrifyingly still. The tired, irritated woman vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating machine. The shift was instantaneous. Her breathing shallowed out, becoming imperceptible. Her eyes, previously dull and averted, locked onto the center of Miller's chest. The center of mass. She didn't look at his face. Faces were distracting. Faces showed fear, or anger, or pain. She only looked at the target. "Take your hand off me," she said. The volume of her voice hadn't raised, but the tone had shifted. It was no longer flat. It was a promise, a hollow, hollowed-out sound. Miller hesitated. For a split second, the primitive lizard part of his brain registered that he had just grabbed onto a live wire. He felt the absolute lack of give in her shoulder, the dense, coiled muscle underneath the jacket. But the alcohol and the watchful eyes of his buddies pushed him forward. "Or what, sweetheart?" he mocked, squeezing tighter, pressing directly into the bruised nerve endings. "You gonna melt on me?" Rowan's left foot slid backward, shifting her center of gravity. Her right hand opened, fingers slightly curled, preparing for the strike. She felt a profound sense of sadness mixed with an ugly, dark anticipation. She didn't want to do this. The paperwork, the police, the military police, the inevitable questions about her mental stability. But he was leaving her no choice. The pain in her shoulder was blinding. "Miller, man, let it go! She's a freak! Just let her walk!" Jenkins called from the table, sounding nervous now. The atmosphere in the immediate vicinity had grown incredibly dense. The bartender had stopped wiping the counter and was quietly reaching for the heavy wooden bat kept near the register. "Nah, she needs to learn some manners," Miller said, his grip tightening. He leaned his face down toward hers. "I said, or what?" Rowan's jaw clenched. The scar tissue pulled taut. She drew the breath in for the strike. The heavy oak door at the front of the bar didn't just open. It groaned, the rusted hinges squealing in protest as it was shoved inward with deliberate force. A blast of cold December wind swept through the room, carrying the scent of rain and wet asphalt, momentarily cutting through the smell of bleach and sweat. 3 men walked in. They didn't swagger. They didn't announce their presence with loud voices or heavy boots. They moved with a synchronized, fluid economy of motion that looked almost lazy to the untrained eye, but practically vibrated with lethal intent. Rowan's peripheral vision caught the movement. Her strike hand relaxed slightly. She didn't turn her head, but she didn't need to. She knew the cadence of those footsteps better than she knew her own heartbeat. Wyatt came first. He wore a faded flannel shirt over a thermal, his dark hair grown out and unruly. He had a slight, rolling limp in his left leg, a souvenir from a rooftop in Fallujah that hadn't quite healed right. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, immediately scanned the room in quadrants, cataloguing exits, sight lines, and threats. He took up a position by the front door, leaning his back against the wall, casually crossing his arms. He looked bored. He was anything but. Behind him was Cole. Cole was a mountain of a man, wide-shouldered and thick-chested, wearing a dark canvas jacket that looked too tight across his back. The left side of his face was shadowed by a ragged, uneven ear, half of it missing from a close-quarters firefight years ago. He moved past Wyatt with a heavy, rolling gait, his eyes fixed on the floor, seemingly ignoring the entire room. And finally, Hayes. Hayes was the oldest. His beard was completely grey, closely cropped, matching the short hair on his head. He wore a simple black t-shirt despite the cold, his arms wrapped in faded, sprawling tattoos. He didn't look like a soldier. He looked like a weary lumberjack or a mechanic who had seen too many long shifts. But his eyes were like dead water, flat, unblinking, devoid of any surface emotion. They were her Trident brothers, her former team. The men who had dug her out of the rubble, who had kept their hands pressed against her throat to stop the bleeding while the medevac chopped through the night sky. The bar went dead silent. The jukebox had faded out between songs, and the only sound was the defective buzz of the neon sign. The three men didn't say a word to Rowan. They didn't yell at the Marines. They didn't make a scene. Cole simply walked up to the bar, stepping directly into the small space between Miller and Rowan. He didn't ask Miller to move. He just occupied the space, his sheer physical mass forcing the young Marine to take a half-step backward, breaking his grip on Rowan's shoulder. Cole leaned his forearms heavily on the bar counter, right where Miller had been standing. He smelled of black coffee, old leather, and something metallic, like gun oil. "Bartender," Cole rumbled, his voice a deep, gravelly bass that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "3 waters. Ice." Miller blinked, looking at the massive man who had just materialized beside him. The sudden break in contact with Rowan left him disoriented. He puffed out his chest, trying to reclaim his lost momentum. "Hey, pal. We were in the middle of a conversation here." Cole didn't turn his head. He kept his eyes on the bartender, who was hurriedly grabbing glasses. "Conversation's over," Cole said softly. "Who the hell are you?" Miller demanded, though his voice lacked the volume it had 3 minutes ago. Hayes moved. He didn't approach the bar. Instead, he walked slowly toward the booth where the other 3 Marines were sitting. He stopped about 2 feet from the edge of their table. He didn't look at them. He just stood there, his hands resting easily in the pockets of his jeans, staring blankly at the wall behind them. The sheer wrongness of it, a stranger standing silently, perfectly still, right in their personal space, was deeply unsettling. Jenkins shifted uncomfortably in the booth. "Can we help you, old man?" Jenkins asked, trying to sound tough. Hayes slowly turned his head. He looked at Jenkins. He didn't glare. He didn't scowl. He just looked at him with those dead water eyes, assessing him the way a butcher assesses a cut of meat. It wasn't a look of anger. It was a look of complete, chilling apathy. Jenkins swallowed hard, breaking eye contact, and suddenly finding his half-empty beer fascinating. Back at the bar, Miller was still trying to serve face. He reached out to tap Cole on the shoulder. "Look, buddy, I don't know who you think you are." Before Miller's finger could touch the canvas jacket, Cole's right hand moved. It was a blur, a sudden eruption of speed from a man that size. Cole's hand clamped down over Miller's wrist. He didn't twist it. He didn't strike him. He just squeezed. The sound of the tendons in Miller's wrist grinding together was faintly audible. Miller's face went pale, his eyes widening in sudden, shocking agony. He tried to pull his arm back, but his wrist was locked in a vice grip of calloused flesh and bone-crushing pressure. Cole slowly turned his head to look at Miller. "You're standing too close to her," Cole whispered. The softness of his voice was terrifying. Rowan stood perfectly still, watching the scene unfold. The blinding pain in her shoulder was throbbing, a dull ache replacing the sharp spike. She looked at Cole's grip on the kid's wrist. She looked at Hayes, standing like a grim reaper by the booth. She looked at Wyatt by the door, who was currently examining his fingernails, perfectly relaxed while blocking the only exit. She felt a sudden, profound exhaustion wash over her, heavier than the physical fatigue. She didn't feel vindicated. She didn't feel like a rescued damsel. She felt annoyed. Annoyed at the Marines for their stupidity, annoyed at the world for making her a freak, and intensely, deeply annoyed at her former teammates for treating her like someone who needed a babysitter. "Let him go, Cole," Rowan said. Her voice cut through the tension, harsh and grating. Cole didn't move immediately. He kept his eyes locked on Miller's pale face for a long, agonizing second. Then he slowly released his grip. Miller stumbled backward, cradling his wrist against his chest, his bravado entirely evaporated. He looked from Cole to Rowan, realizing with sudden, horrifying clarity that the scarred, quiet woman he had been tormenting was connected to these dangerous, quiet men. He had mistaken her restraint for fear. "Get your boys," Hayes said from the booth, finally speaking. His voice was quiet, lacking any inflection. "Pay your tab. Leave." No one argued. The Marines scrambled. Jenkins threw a $50 bill onto the table, not waiting for change. They filed past Wyatt at the door, keeping their heads down, their loud boots suddenly sounding very hurried and very quiet. Wyatt didn't move an inch to let them pass. They had to squeeze around him, desperate to get out into the cold rain. The door shut behind them, leaving the bar in silence once again. Rowan stood there for a moment, her chest rising and falling. She looked at the three men, the men who knew exactly what the scars on her neck felt like when they were fresh, burning wounds. The men who had washed her blood off their hands. Cole picked up one of the waters the bartender had nervously placed on the counter. He took a sip, then looked down at Rowan. "You're losing your touch, Finn." Cole rumbled, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk touching the corner of his mouth. "You used to break their jaws before they finished the sentence." Rowan closed her eyes, letting out a long, ragged breath that sounded halfway between a sigh and a laugh. "I was trying," she muttered, rubbing the good side of her neck. "To have a quiet night." Rain lashed against the cracked front window of the bar, distorting the defective neon sign into a smeared, bleeding streak of cherry red. Rowan didn't look at the three men who had just cleared the room for her. She simply slid her good hand over her face, pressing her fingertips hard into her eyelids until bursts of static popped behind her retinas, trying to push away the sudden, aggressive thumping behind her temples. Wyatt finally pushed off the plaster wall by the door. He moved with that infuriating, silent grace, dragging a heavy wooden chair from a nearby table over to the booth the Marines had just vacated. He sat backward, crossing his arms over the scarred wooden backrest, resting his chin on his forearm. "You look terrible, Finn," Wyatt observed. His voice was a soft, unhurried Georgia drawl that entirely belied the fact he could field strip an MK-13 sniper rifle in total darkness. "Go to hell, Wyatt!" Rowan rasped. Cole let out a low, rumbling chuckle that sounded like gravel shifting in a cement mixer. He didn't sit. He remained standing by the bar, occupying space like a load-bearing pillar, keeping his back to the room and his eyes on the street outside the window. Hayes took the seat opposite Wyatt in the booth. He moved slowly, joints popping in the damp air. He placed his hands flat on the sticky tabletop. His knuckles were swollen, mapped with pale white scars that stood out starkly against his tanned skin. "Shoulders acting up," Hayes stated. It wasn't a question. Rowan finally turned around, her boots dragging slightly on the linoleum. She walked over to the booth and slid into the vinyl seat next to Hayes. The leather hissed under her weight. She didn't bother denying it. With these men, lying about physical pain was not just pointless, it was a tactical error. "It's the damp," she muttered, rolling the joint forward. A sharp, audible click echoed from her collarbone. She winced, the pink, waxy scar tissue on her neck pulling tight against her jaw. And some idiot kid grabbing the exact spot where the plate carrier failed. Wyatt reached into the chest pocket of his flannel shirt and tossed a small, unmarked orange plastic bottle onto the table. It rattled against the wood. Ibuprofen 800s, and a couple of muscle relaxers slipped in for flavor. Take them. Rowan stared at the bottle. She hated the pills. They made her head fuzzy, made her slow. Out here, in the civilian world, being slow felt more dangerous than being in a war zone. Out here, the threats didn't wear uniforms or carry rifles. They wore cheap cologne and grabbed you from behind when you were just trying to drink a beer. I was handling it, she said, her voice dropping to a defensive, quiet register. We know, Cole said from the bar, not turning around. You were going to drop his center of gravity, blow out his right knee, and put your thumb through his larynx. The bartender would have hit the panic button, the local cops would have shown up, and you'd be sitting in a holding cell answering questions from a precinct captain who doesn't understand why a disabled female veteran just dismantled a 200-pound Marine in under 4 seconds. Rowan swallowed hard. The metallic taste of old adrenaline was still bitter on the back of her tongue. Cole was right. She had been operating on pure, unadulterated muscle memory, blinded by the sudden spike of pain. She hadn't been thinking about the aftermath. We didn't step in to protect you, Finn, Hayes added, his voice flat, his dead water eyes finally locking onto hers. We stepped in to protect our operational security. You make the evening news for a bar brawl, and suddenly your face is in the system. We can't afford that right now. Rowan froze. The ache in her shoulder temporarily vanished, replaced by a sudden, icy drop in her stomach. She looked at Hayes. Really looked at him. The grey in his beard was thicker than the last time she saw him, at the VA hospital in San Diego 18 months ago. The lines around his eyes were carved deeper. Wyatt wasn't just casually sitting backward in a chair. His eyes were systematically tracking the headlights of every car that drove past the window. Cole wasn't just standing by the bar, he was blocking the line of sight from the street to the booth. They weren't here for a reunion. They were on the clock. I'm retired, Hayes, Rowan said softly. The words tasted like ash. Medical discharge. Honorable. I get a check on the 1st of the month, and I go to physical therapy on Tuesdays. I'm out. Nobody is ever really out, Wyatt murmured, picking at a splinter on the table. I am, she insisted, tapping a finger against the rigid scar on her neck. Look at me. I have a tremor in my dominant hand. I can't turn my head past 45 degrees to the right without tearing a graft. Half the time, I smell burning copper when I try to sleep. I am a liability. Hayes reached inside his jacket. He didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a folded, heavy-stock manila envelope, the edges worn soft from being carried. He set it on the table between them, directly next to the orange pill bottle. It smelled like old paper and airline exhaust. We don't need you to pull a trigger, Rowan, Hayes said, using her first name. That alone was enough to make the hairs on the back of her arms stand up. They only used first names when the situation was deeply, fundamentally FUBAR. We need your brain. We need your eyes. Rowan stared at the envelope. She didn't want to touch it. Touching it meant acknowledging the gravitational pull of the life she had tried to bury under cheap beer and cheap motels. But the tremor in her right hand, the one she had been fighting all night, suddenly vanished. Her body, conditioned for a decade to crave purpose, was betraying her mind's desire for peace. Who? She asked, the single syllable scraping against her damaged vocal cords. Hayes didn't answer immediately. He looked at Wyatt, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod, then at Cole, who remained as still as a statue by the window. Open it, Hayes instructed. Rowan hesitated. The neon light outside buzzed, a dying insect trapped in a glass tube. She reached out with her left hand, her offhand, the one that didn't shake, and hooked a finger under the flap of the envelope. She pulled out a stack of glossy, high-resolution surveillance photographs and a thin, heavily redacted dossier. She spread the photos across the sticky table. They were taken with a long lens. The grainy quality suggested extreme distance, probably shot through thermal distortion. They showed a man in his late 40s, wearing a tailored, unremarkable grey suit. He was standing on a balcony overlooking a crowded, sun-drenched street that looked like it belonged in a coastal European city. He had sharp, angular features, thinning hair, and a distinct, almost elegant posture. Rowan didn't recognize his face. But as she flipped to the third photo, a close-up of the man holding a lit cigarette, her breath hitched. The man was missing the top joint of his left index finger. The air in the bar suddenly felt too thin to breathe. The smell of stale beer and bleach vanished, violently replaced by the phantom stench of pulverized concrete, raw sewage, and vaporized copper wire. She was back in Raqqa, the suffocating heat of the courtyard, the dead silence that fell right before the pressure wave hit, the high-pitched whine of the command wire arming the daisy-chained artillery shells buried under the dirt floor. The architect, that was the call sign Intel had given him. He wasn't a fighter. He didn't carry a rifle. He built the improvised explosive devices that were so meticulously designed, so perfectly engineered, that they bypassed every electronic jammer the convoy had. He was a ghost who dealt in ammonium nitrate and modified cell phone boards, and he was the reason Rowan's face looked like melted wax. She stared at the missing finger joint in the photograph. Intel reports from 6 years ago had noted that the architect had lost the tip of that finger to a faulty blasting cap early in his career. "His name is Sullivan," Hayes said quietly, watching the micro-expressions ripple across Rowan's scarred face. "Or at least, that's the alias he's using now. He surfaced in Marseille 3 weeks ago." Rowan's chest tightened. "Why is he in Marseille? He's not building basement bombs for insurgents anymore." Wyatt chimed in, his drawl entirely gone, replaced by a sharp, clinical edge. "He's moved up the food chain. He's consulting, selling proprietary trigger mechanisms to independent contractors, high-yield, zero-signature explosives, the kind that take down commercial aircraft without leaving a trace of chemical residue." Rowan traced the edge of the photograph. The tremor was back in her right hand, but this time it wasn't from nerve damage. It was pure, unadulterated adrenaline. It felt like ice water in her veins. "CIA knows?" she asked. "CIA is the reason we're sitting in this shithole," Cole said, finally turning away from the window and taking heavy, measured steps towards the booth. "They have an extraction team on standby, but they can't locate his workshop. Sullivan is paranoid. He uses couriers, dead drops, analog communications. He never stays in the same place for more than 48 hours. So let the agency sweep the city," Rowan countered, forcing herself to lean back against the vinyl seat, putting physical distance between herself and the photos. "They have satellites. They have algorithms." "Algorithms don't know how he thinks," Hayes said softly. "You do." Rowan barked a harsh, bitter laugh that ended in a cough. She tapped her neck. "He blew me up, Hayes. He outsmarted me. That doesn't make me an expert. It makes me a casualty." "It makes you the only EOD specialist who ever survived a direct hit from one of his cascading trigger arrays." Wyatt corrected her, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You spent 3 years hunting his signature, Finn. You know how he wires his secondary charges. You know his tells. You know his ego." Rowan closed her eyes. She remembered the endless nights in the Tactical Operations Center, staring at photos of blasted craters, tracing the scorch marks, trying to understand the twisted, brilliant logic of the man who built the bombs. She knew his work better than she knew the back of her own hand. "He's changed his methodology," Hayes pressed, tapping the redacted dossier. "The trigger we recovered from a botched job in Berlin last month. It's a completely closed loop. No radio frequency, no pressure plate. The agency techs are baffled. But Cole looked at the schematics. Cole nodded slowly. It's a chemical timer, Finn. Corrosive acid eating through a wire to break a circuit. It's old school, but the way it's housed, it reminded me of the rig you found in that basement in Fallujah. The one you diffused blind. Rowan opened her eyes. The tactical processor in her brain, dormant for over a year, suddenly booted up, humming with dangerous, familiar electricity. A chemical timer, acid eating through a retaining wire. It was brilliant. It was entirely untraceable by standard electronic sweeps. If he's using corrosive timers, he has to source industrial-grade nitric acid. Rowan muttered, almost speaking to herself. And he can't transport it easily. It's unstable, which means his workshop has to be within a 20-mile radius of a specific type of chemical supplier, mostly agricultural or heavy manufacturing. The three men went perfectly still. Wyatt smiled, a thin, predatory curving of his lips. See? Hayes said, leaning back. You've been out of the game for 18 months, and it took you 10 seconds to narrow a city of 900,000 people down to a manageable search grid. Rowan looked at her hands. The right one was steady now. The left one was curled into a fist. The contradictory nature of her existence gnawed at her. She hated the violence. She hated what it had done to her body, what it had done to her soul. But sitting here, looking at the face of the man who had stolen her reflection, she felt a terrible, undeniable clarity. Civilian life was a blur of meaningless interactions and loud noises. This, hunting the monster in the dark, was the only thing that made sense. I can't carry a rifle, Hayes, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. I have no mobility on my right flank. If we get into a gunfight, I am dead weight. If we get into a gunfight, Wyatt and I will handle it, Cole said simply, placing a massive hand gently on the table. You aren't the shield anymore, Finn. You're the compass. Hayes reached into his jacket again and pulled out a burner phone. He set it on top of the photographs. Flight leaves from Portland International in 4 hours. Cargo plane. No TSA, no questions. Hers stated. He didn't ask her to come. He didn't plead. He just laid out the logistics. Rowan stared at the cheap plastic phone. She thought about her motel room down the street, the saggy mattress, the smell of cheap pine cleaner, the endless, agonizing quiet of a life with no mission. Then she thought about the courtyard in Raqqa, the heat, the flash. She reached up and touched the jagged pink tissue on her neck. It didn't feel like melted wax anymore. It felt like armor. She picked up the burner phone and slipped it into her jacket pocket. She grabbed the bottle of ibuprofen and tossed it back to Wyatt. I won't need those, Rowan said, sliding out of the booth. Her boots hit the linoleum, the sound sharp and heavy with purpose. She looked at the 3 lethal ghosts standing before her, her brothers, her blood. Let's go hunt. Rowan finally steps back into the shadows, trading her quiet, painful civilian life for the hunt that left her scarred. The architect is out there, and her old squad knows she's the only one who can track his deadly signature. Will her physical limits be a liability, or will her brilliant mind outplay the man who nearly killed her? Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video so you don't miss the explosive next chapter.